All right, looks like the recording is going and we have more students filing in, so perfect. I'll send invites to anyone not here really quickly. If they're logged on, they can jump in. All right, so last time we ended up talking about neurons and the development of the dendrites and axon branches. So today we will talk first about the signal transmission, how the action potential actually goes down through the neuron. Before that, though, just a quick reminder, your first exam is coming up in a little more than a week. So again, these are multiple choice. In Canvas, you have a study guide. So here in Unit 1, near the bottom of Unit 1, there's a Unit Exam 1 study guide that has questions that are kind of open-ended. You can expect a couple multiple choice questions on those same topics. And then there's a bunch of multiple choice questions at the end of the study guide that will show you essentially exactly what the kind of questions will be like on the exam. Some of those exact questions will be on the exam, so answering those will get you very well prepped. If you have any questions about the study guide in between now and then, I won't be going over the entire study guide in the class unless we end up having time on Thursday. Like if we finish up all the Chapter 4 content in time, I might go over some of those questions. But otherwise, just send me an email, be like, hey, number 5, I was a little confused. Is it C or D? And I can answer that. So yeah. Hopefully you started your studying, reviewing chapters 1 and 2 as we're finishing up 3 today and then going to 4. All right, so the next thing to talk about is how do neurons actually send their messages? It's a kind of critical component of a lot of things in our lives. So let's watch this little video. Let me know if you cannot hear or see the video as it gets started. It looks on my settings like you should be able to, so definitely let me know if anything's wrong.
Pain you experience when you burn your hand results so quickly in an action by your muscles. Many animals respond to environmental stimuli using specialized cells called neurons. A stimulus is detected by sensory receptors, and the body responds through motor effectors. These cells working together allow you to respond very quickly to threats. When you touch something hot, heat receptors of a sensory neuron detect the stimuli and send the information of heat to an interneuron in your central nervous system. From there, a motor neuron sends a response from your central nervous system to the skeletal muscles in your arm, causing them to contract and pull your hand away. The fundamental process of neural transmission that underlies this action occurs in all neurons of the body. Neurons.
So before we jump ahead to looking inside the neuron, let's go back to this image. So as you touch something, each of these is a different example, visual example of a neuron. So a sensory neuron, you've got a bunch of sensory neurons. You have sensory neurons in your tongue and nose that detect chemicals. You have sensory neurons in your eyes that detect light waves, wavelengths. You've got sensory neurons in your ears called hair cells that detect pressure. And then you've got sensory neurons in your skin that detect temperature, touch, pain, heat. I think I said temperature already. A bunch of things. They're responsible for a lot. So you could think of the end of that, the detecting piece, as the end of a dendrite of a neuron. And then it sends the message. That's what this little glowing orb is trying to indicate, that that's the actual message being sent up. And here's the cell body of this one. So it looks a little different than an interneuron, but it's still a neuron. Then it sends it down its axon, connects with this interneuron. So all of your brain, so all of the neurons within your brain up here are all interneurons. And then a motor neuron has a different ending. So the message comes in through its dendrites, down its axon, and then to its axon branches, where instead of sending the neurotransmitters to activate another neuron, it generally sends chemicals to activate the muscle cells, to actually make the muscle cells contract. So that's our type of neuron, sensory, inter, and motor. So interneuron is what most of your neurons all of your neurons in your brain, and also most of your neurons in your body are interneurons. But you also obviously have a lot of sensory and a lot of motor neurons. All right. Interestingly, for this specific action of burning your hand, the message tends not to go to your brain before actually moving your arm away. So it goes to your spinal cord, and we have the evolved capacity for certain kind of messages from sensory neurons that it'll get that message back to your spinal cord and immediately send a message to your motor neurons to move your hand. So that's just an evolved capacity so that we can be protected from things like really bad injuries or cuts or burns. And so as you are pulling your arm back, then the message is getting to your brain, and you know, oh, I've just gotten burned, and your hand is already by itself moving back. You can obviously change that. So if you grab, I mean, this one's cold, but if you grab like a hot cup of coffee and you're over your laptop, you can, with your prefrontal cortex, choose and say, hey, I still need to hold on to this hot coffee, even if I have that reaction to move my hand back. So you can stop that process and be like, hey, no, I'm going to hold on to this because I'd rather burn my hand a little bit than destroy my computer or something like that. Just as an example. Not like that's ever happened to me before. Actually happened to my wife earlier today. Hopefully she can't hear me making fun of her. Probably shouldn't make fun of her. To a recorded message to an entire class.
The stimuli and send the information of heat to an
So let's go on to what is happening at the cellular and molecular level of these neurons.
Occurs in all neurons of the body. Neurons transmit this information through changes in the electrical potential of the membrane by the movement of ions across the membrane. An electrochemical gradient governs the movement of these ions, resulting in an electrical impulse. The resting membrane potential in a neuron, when the cell is not firing an impulse, is established by the unequal distribution of sodium ions outside of the cell and potassium ions inside the cell.
All right, so there's a lot of chemistry right here that it's talking about. If you've been in a chemistry class before, this might be a little easier to see and grasp, but I do want to go into this much detail in this example because I do think it helps students to understand the basic processes. Obviously, for the exam, you're not going to need to memorize every single step of this process, but knowing a little bit more will help you understand the more basic processes. So right here, this is a cell body of a neuron. And this is, let's say this is its axon, and we're zooming in on one little portion of the axon. So that's what we're zooming into. We're looking at the molecular level
Of the body.
So this here is the outside of the axon. So the fluid that the brain is floating in, that all these neurons are floating in within the brain, you can see in the background there's other neurons. This outside of any neuron is slightly positive. So what an ion is just a charged particle. So there are charged chemical particles outside here and differently charged particles inside the neuron. So this is the inside of the neuron. So again, this line here is one of the membranes of the axon. So if my arm was an axon, and these are the axon branches, we are looking at essentially a chunk right here. So just the top portion. So beneath the screen, down here somewhere, there's another membrane. So this is the inside of that axon. So we're going to learn how does that message get down the axon. Even though sometimes we describe the process of connecting neurons as being like wires or network cables in computers, it's not actually like that. It's not sending, say, an electron or any chemical straight down that tube, so straight down that axon. Instead, what's happening is this chemical process at these channels all along the axon. So let's review this again and go a little bit further, and then I'll talk about it in a slightly different way to give you some more visual examples and understand the chemical process.
Neurons transmit this information through changes in the electrical potential of the membrane by the movement of ions across the membrane. An electrochemical gradient governs the movement of these ions, resulting in an electrical impulse. The resting membrane potential in a neuron, when the cell is not firing an impulse, is established by the unequal distribution of sodium ions outside of the cell and potassium ions inside the cell, making the outside of the cell more positively charged compared to the inside. The electrochemical gradient is established and maintained by an enzyme called sodium-potassium ATPase. When a neuron is stimulated, sodium ion channels open and sodium ions flow into the cell. This leads to a change in the electrical potential across the membrane called depolarization.
So that little glowing orb that was floating along here, that's indicating the message is going down the axon. So what's actually happening though for that is that these channels are opening up and letting those sodium ions in, so that now instead the polarity is reversed. So that is the entire process of how a neuron sends a message down its axon, is in this little bit of a wave down the whole thing.
Polarization. The depolarizing electrical potential travels down the dendrites and over the cell body. Multiple electrical potentials will combine at the axon hillock in a process called summation. If the depolarization is large enough, an action potential is triggered. Action potentials are all or none electrical impulses that maintain their amplitude and strength down the length of the axon. The action potential travels down the axon when the depolarization of an area of membrane causes adjacent voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open. The influx of sodium ions results in membrane depolarization along the membrane. After a short delay, potassium ion channels open and potassium ions flow out, repolarizing the membrane. For the neuron to fire again, the resting membrane potential needs to be reestablished. Sodium-potassium ATPase is used to move sodium and potassium ions against their concentration gradients, reestablishing the resting membrane potential.
So this is all down to this really small molecular process, sending basically the positively charged ions from out here to into the membrane of the cell. So this is the top and the bottom of the axon here. This is the inside of the axon. So we're not sending a single ion like all the way down the tube. This is the way it keeps its same strength and amplitude the whole time. When you send electrons down a wire towards, say, a light bulb, or as a signal to, say, a telephone or a computer, it can lose some of those electrons on the way because of resistance and other things. This gets around that essentially because it's not sending a message all the way down this long tube. Some of your axons in your body are up to 3 feet long. So there's axons that are going from the base of your brains, or like your brain right here, all the way down your spine, so your entire spinal cord's length to where your tailbone is. So you have axons that are that long. So it has to keep that same energy the entire time, and this is how it does it, by just very, very small movements of a molecule from here to here and here to here. So that's how in a wave pattern, it sends the message all the way down that axon. So you can think of, if my fingers are the channels, it's opening up in a wave pattern all the way down. And that happens so dramatically quickly that neurons can fire. I think it's almost most neurons can fire, I think, almost 10,000 times a second, which is really dramatically quickly. So it couldn't happen that quickly if you were trying to fire a ion or an electron or something all the way down this tube that quickly. This is possible because you're moving these molecules just a very little bit across that membrane.
As the action potential moves down the axon, ions are diffusing only a short distance, allowing the signal to move quickly. At the axon terminal, the electrical impulse passes to another cell at a cellular connection called a synapse. The space between the presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic cell is called the synaptic cleft. The presynaptic neuron contains signal molecules called neurotransmitters that are packaged inside vesicles.
So one example of a neurotransmitter would be dopamine or serotonin. So this is where those live at the end of that axon branch to then be able to communicate with the next neuron in the network of neurons.
When an action potential reaches the end of a neuron, neurotransmitters are released by exocytosis from the neuron into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitters bind to the adjacent cell at receptor sites attached to ion channels. The channels open, allowing the movement of ions into or out of the effector cell, which alters its membrane potential, thereby transmitting the signal from the neuron to the effector cell. Because nerve impulses move very rapidly down the axon of a neuron and move from cell to cell across synapses, you react quickly to a stimulus, like burning your finger.
All right, so hopefully you have a little bit better idea. Like reading it in the book, I think reading it, and your book has some good pictures, but for me, seeing that visual example is a lot easier to understand that whole process, to know how exactly that message is being sent. So if we look at this picture of a neuron again, this axon and also the entire cell body, the entire length of a dendrite, that same process is happening, that the channels are opening and closing in rapid succession to send the same strength of message, to send essentially that depolarization all the way down this axon, all the way to the end of the axon branches. So one thing with that is this myelin sheath. We talk about it as an insulation, but it also helps speed up processing, because as we get the channels to here, essentially this whole space that the myelin is covering is now also the same polarization as the last gate. So it basically gives you this whole span of axon that you don't need to open up new channels on until you get to the gaps between the myelin. So then you open up a new channel here and continue the message all the way. So it's kind of like little jumps. You're kind of jumping this whole gap. And so the myelin helps speed up processing. This is why we talk about young adulthood is when the brain finishes developing. What we're talking about there is all the structures are there, the connections are there, the neurons are in the right place, but it's not till about age 23 that your brain finishes its myelination. So, and that's happening in the prefrontal cortex. Essentially, it happens from back here up to the front is kind of the way that the myelination happens. So it's not till that myelination is finished that your brain is at, I guess you could say, its peak capacity, its peak adult capacity of speed. And that's because of these myelin sheaths helping speed up the transmission of that signal down the axon. So this is a really important process to understand, because the connection between neurons, we'll see even in just a couple minutes as we talk about it in relation to infant motor development and perceptual development. This process is really important for us to do anything in life. So our emotions, how we think, how we remember, our making decisions, our experiences, our sensations, our perceptions, all of that is dependent on this process of the neurons speaking with one another and sending messages down them. So questions about it? Hopefully those couple visual examples help you understand the process. And we can talk about now, what does that do in the brain and body? All right, so in those first years of life, a lot of changes are happening to the neurons in the brain. So the myelination is really rapid. So like I said, it doesn't finish up until about 23, but it's starting already at the time of birth. So myelination has already started in some of the older, evolutionarily older parts of the brain. So the connectivity between neurons with their axons and dendrites is always changing with plasticity. So at about age 2, we have about twice as many neural connections than we will ever use. So at that point, by age 2, we've got so many more neural connections, and then we prune a bunch away, only the ones that we're using. So if you have some that you're using for specific languages or movements or things like that, they'll start to get pruned away, but then you can develop new ones later on if you're learn the guitar or the piano or how to skateboard. So each single neuron, so every single neuron within the network could be connected to as many as 100 or 1,000 other neurons. So that's how intertwined and connected these neural networks are. So any single neuron, I know our examples in class so far have been like one or two neurons talking to the single neuron, and it's talking to one or two other neurons. But in reality, any neuron could be connected to 1,000 neurons. So 400 that it might be sending messages to, 600 that it's getting messages from as part, and each of those other neurons that it's connected to that many other neurons. So that's how neural networks are made, and a lot of things with our sensation, perception, memory, cognition is dependent on those networks. So pruning is what we call the process of those dendrites or axon branches being reabsorbed. Kind of like pruning a tree, you're cutting off that branch or you're reabsorbing that branch. So it's not used anymore, or if it's not being used. All right, so your book goes into a lot of detail on all these different brain structures. We will focus on a couple of them because they're ones that are going to come up quite a few times, but we're going to kind of breeze through a few of them. So some that we will definitely touch on is amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and cerebral cortex. And we'll talk about some of the others really briefly today, but those are some of the ones you should maybe write down a note. So cerebral cortex, hypothalamus, hippocampus, and amygdala as things that are going to be important for socio-emotional development later on, social interactions later on. So I often also mess up the names of hypothalamus and hippocampus. Sometimes I flip them. So just so you know, hypothalamus is more for like, what's the word? Motivation. That's what I was looking for. So motivation, reward, punishment. So eating, drinking, sex, emotion, stress, all very important for hypothalamus, versus hippocampus, which is another H word, is involved in memory. So hippocampus is memory, hypothalamus, motivation, emotion, reward. Amygdala is also very important for emotions and directing like fight and flight response. All right, so the hindbrain is the basal part of our brain. It's the oldest evolutionary wise. So if you look at the brains of lizards, they also have a hindbrain. Most of their brain is what we have as our hindbrain. And then they have some additional pieces on top of that. So you could basically think of this part of the brain evolved first, and then it kind of ballooned out. So as we evolved, we gained new brain capacities, or we got, I guess you could think of it as upgrades, new components like added on to those brain structures. So now we have quite a few components, versus lizards only have like the hindbrain and a little more. The major thing with the hindbrain and the medulla specifically is that it controls a lot of basic survival functions. So your heart beating, your breathing, your cerebellum, this big wrinkly area right here that looks a lot different than this wrinkly area. That's very important for balance as well as vision and coordinating your movements. So the brainstem is where a lot of information is coming through. So from the cerebral cortex, information coming through your midbrain and then going down through the brainstem, then your sensory nerves, a lot of them, at least from like your limbs, are coming through here, versus your eyes go to your midbrain. So a lot of things like alertness, basic survival is done there in the hindbrain. Midbrain is basically connecting those lower survival functions to the higher, more cognitive intensive functions. So this is where messages from your eyes and ears are coming in and then getting directed to different parts of your brain, like the occipital lobe or the, I literally just forgot its name. It's probably on the next slide though. Or the temporal lobe. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. Lots of parts of the brain. So with this, the midbrain has a lot of long axons connecting to many different parts of the brain. So the forebrain is the most highly evolved or newest in evolutionary time part of your brain. It includes basically the very top middle portion of your brain as well as the outer wrinkly portion. So your limbic system is that like top middle portion of your brain all the way inside, and it's very important for the amygdala for survival, social rituals, emotions are a big part of the amygdala. And then the hippocampus, like I mentioned a minute ago, is very important for memory storage. That being said, it's not that the memories themselves are being stored in the hippocampus. Did I mix it up in the slides? I might have. No. Okay. So yeah, hippocampus is the one that does the memories. So it's directing the other cells in the cerebral cortex of where are memories. It's kind of like the directory saying this is where this file or this is where this memory is stored in the rest of the cerebral cortex. So it's really important for that. The thalamus is a relay station. It integrates information from the senses. Also, portions of it get information from hormones in the body. Basal ganglia is picking up hormones as well. Some of your habitual behaviors are basically started from the basal ganglia. And then hypothalamus, like I mentioned, is one of your body's motivation centers, one of the reward or pleasure centers of the brain. It's not the only one, but the hypothalamus is really important for that. Then the cerebral cortex. We'll stick on this one for a while. It's basically the big wrinkly outer portion that if you were looking at a brain, most of what you would see is cerebral cortex. So it's the newest in evolutionary time. And it is where we do our higher level thinking. It's got these different lobes that do different things. So the occipital lobe is responsible for a lot of our vision. The temporal lobe has a lot of memories stored there, as well as hearing and language. So we actually process on the left side of your head. If you touch near your ear, over here is where we actually process the language. Well, for most people, it can be different in slightly different places, but generally that's where we learn and store language. So frontal lobe is up here, personality, intelligence, voluntary muscle control, goal setting, that's all there. And so we've started learning about these different parts of the brain because different people seem to have different kinds of personalities, or someone would get an injury and they acted differently before versus after their injury. So what did we learn from this person, Phineas Gage? What did we learn from them? Does anybody remember Phineas Gage from your book? Either raise your hand or just take over the mic. Let us know what you remember about Phineas Gage and what Phineas Gage taught us about the brain and parts of the brain. You could also type it if you don't have access to your microphone, but hopefully someone remembers why Phineas Gage is important, and what's that thing he's holding as well. So we've got a comment. Did he use himself as an experiment to understand the brain better? Yes and no. He was a quasi-experiment that showed us a little bit about the brain, but it wasn't actually intentional on Phineas's part. So Phineas worked on a railroad, and at the railroad, this is actually a railroad tie. The important thing about this specific railroad tie is there was an explosion that sent this railroad tie through his head. So it went here about where his cheek is, damaged his eye, and went through the frontal lobe of his brain. So he lived, obviously he's alive in the, well, I guess not obviously, but he is alive in this picture. He survived that, this railroad tie going through his head, and it damaged his frontal lobe. So physicians and psychologists, they knew which part of his brain was damaged, and it basically became a example that before he had a specific personality. People thought he was generally a pretty nice guy. He was pretty reliable, went to work on time, was a good family man, he was reported to be, but then after his frontal lobe was damaged, he was seen as emotionally shallow, really distractible, insensitive, rude. He wouldn't follow directions. He wasn't as good of a family man after that. And that the only thing that changed was his accident, that his brain was damaged. So it was an example of a quasi-experiment where this accident showed us before and after the kind of personality change that might be different based on injury to the frontal lobe. So a really interesting example of that. You can even find pictures of his skull because he's since died. This was many, many years ago. But I believe his skull is still in a museum. So with that being said, these kinds of things, injuries, infections, helped us see before we had things like MRIs, what parts of the brain might be responsible for certain things. So if someone suddenly was unable to speak and they died a few years later and you dissected them and saw that, oh, their temporal lobe has all been eaten by essentially cancer or some sort of infection. That's some of the ways that we originally started to figure out which parts of the brain were responsible for what. Now it's, I don't know if you, yeah, now we can test different areas of the brain in, say, rats by specifically damaging specific areas or looking at the effects of certain chemicals on certain areas. Or we can even do things like MRIs or EEGs and look at the activity in certain areas of the brain to really get a better idea of how the brain is all working together. So again, the frontal lobes of the cerebral cortex, that's where a lot of our higher order thinking is happening. So when we're born, a lot of these areas of the cerebral cortex are starting to get their first chance at doing things. So in the womb, you can hear, and the temporal lobe is active. You're actually starting to get a sense of what the pitch and like timbre and pattern of human speech is. So babies come out of the womb with the easier ability to grasp and understand language. Occipital lobe doesn't get a lot of work in the womb. There's basically sensations of light and dark in the womb. So you've got to gain a lot of your visual perception right from the time you're born and develop that occipital lobe so it knows what you're looking at, what to do, how to process things. So let's look at a couple different areas of the cerebral cortex. So prefrontal cortex is the very foremost, like if you're touching your forehead, right behind that is your prefrontal cortex. It's your most recently evolved area of your brain. It's responsible for planning, reasoning, self-control. You might have a habitual behavior that you want to not do. So the prefrontal cortex can help you do that. So with that being said, that is one of the last portions that get myelinated. It's one of the portions of your brain that works comparatively. The neurons work a little slower than the other neurons in the rest of the brain until you get to be about 23, 24, 25. So yeah, that actually has impacts on emotional development in adolescence and risk-taking behaviors, things like that. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So let's talk about the somatosensory cortex. It is about here in your brain. Your somatosensory and motor cortexes are right about here, where my hairline is trying to recede to, basically. So this is where we're getting our information, our sensations from different aspects of our body sent there. So if you feel something touching your hand versus touching your chest versus touching your leg, it is going to the somatosensory cortex. And this is about, on average, about where people's senses are for those different body parts. You can see we've got a lot more space devoted to our hand and our digits than we do to, say, our legs and feet. So the hand and digits in and of themselves, like size-wise on our body, don't take up that much space. But compare it to how much space is devoted to them in neurons in the body, our trunk, legs, and feet all take up about the same mass of neurons. So we have a lot finer senses in our hands than we do in, say, our trunk, legs, and feet. And also you can see here in these pictures, we've got a lot of sensory neurons for the mouth and the lips, the ears, genitals as well. So there's a lot of space devoted to feeling things in those areas of the body. So the motor cortex is right next to it. So this is what then sends information out to your hands, to your legs, to your mouth, to your tongue, helps with speaking, things like that. So with this, you can see again that there's a lot of space devoted to what we would call fine motor skills of moving the hand, and not very much devoted to the foot and toes and moving those in a more dexterous manner. So knowing what we know about brain plasticity, what do you think might be happening when someone, say, loses their hands, maybe loses their entire upper limbs, but then is able to do something like draw or paint or play a musical instrument using their feet? What do you think is happening within these neurons in the brain? Go for it, Mackie.
Maybe the receptors or the messages are being redirected.
Yeah, that is one of the ways that it can do that. So here, when your brain realizes that it's not actually needing to send information to your hands, it will be able to do one of two things. Either it will redirect those messages, so these messages that might be sent to the toes and might be focused here, that might be redirected to the networks over here that used to be responsible for the fingers. It might also be that this area just gets a lot more dense with a lot more axons and dendrites. So this part over here could be replaced with new messages, or those messages could be resent over here. So what used to be controlling fingers is now controlling toes, or maybe it's just that these areas are getting more dense. In any given person, there'll be some different combination of that. So if all of us in class lost our upper limbs, for some of us, it might be entirely this area has replaced it. For some of us, it might be entirely this area has gotten more dense, and there will be that whole range in between. So the brain's plasticity allows that to happen because they're part of similar networks and movement. They're so close to the somatosensory cortex as well that the areas of the brain that are feeling can send kind of that cross message over to the area that should be moving then. So that's how people are able to, with practice, get so good at dexterity with their feet and their toes, as opposed to just on average, since naturally it's easier for us to use hands. If we have that ability, we'll probably focus on developing those skills and playing guitar with our hands versus playing guitar with our feet. Yeah, if you just wanted to try and do it, that same kind of process would happen. If you tried to learn to play guitar with your feet, you would still be making that area more dense, maybe using some of this area to play guitar with your feet. So it's pretty neat that the brain has that capacity. Similar kinds of things are happening with like phantom limb pain. So here in your somatosensory cortex, you still have these areas. Let's say you've lost one of your hands. So let's say you've lost your right hand, then on the left side of your body, this area of your brain is still responsible for feeling the things from that hand. So if it's getting cross signals from like your arm or other areas over here, it might be feeling pain that way. If there's motor neurons in your arm that are also connected to that area of your hand, you might still feel your hand there because your perception, even though the sensation isn't coming from your hand anymore, you're getting that perception from these interneurons in your brain. So that's one reason phantom limb pain exists. And you might even feel like you can move that limb because those motor neurons are still there in your brain, and they might even still be sending signals down your spinal cord, but there's just no motor neurons at the end and hand to actually move something. So pretty interesting. Corpus callosum is another important part of the brain. It's essentially, let's go back to a picture of an actual brain. All right, here, this is the corpus callosum right there. You might see it looks slightly different. If you ever have a chance to dissect a brain at all, if you poked this area of the brain versus this area, the corpus callosum is really, really dense. versus this is a lot more squishy. So the corpus callosum, what it is hundreds of thousands of axons going from the left to right hemispheres, connecting them together. So your temporal lobe on one side connecting with the occipital lobe and temporal lobe and frontal lobe on the other side of your brain. So that's what the corpus callosum is basically a highway of axons between the two hemispheres. So has anybody in the class ever heard that they are more right-brained or left-brained? Actually, let's just get a bunch of comments. So if you've ever taken a test or heard from someone that you're either right brain or left brain, just put in the meeting chat which one you were. Were you more right brain or were you more left brain? That's a good question, and that's a good question, Rachel. That goes into what we'll talk about next with right brain versus left brain. So yeah, so there's one, I forget if it's right or left brain, one supposedly more artistic, one supposedly more like analytical or mathematical. So we've got a right brain here. I think artistic is left brain, but I forget sometimes. So hopefully other students have maybe heard of this idea before, that people are either right brain or left brain, because it's a good example to show, well, here we've got the corpus callosum connecting both the right and left hemispheres of the brain. So what does that mean for a right brain versus left brain person? Well, actually, it really shows that both sides of the brain are talking to each other all the time. So while we might be a little more artistic or we might be a little more analytical, it's not actually centered in one half of the brain or the other. Some things are a little more centered in one side versus the other. Like I mentioned, language is basically, for most people, is in the left side of the brain, right here in the temporal lobe. So, but what if you lost the whole left half of your brain from injury or something like that? Yeah. The other side of your brain would take on those new responsibilities. So there is not actually any right or left brain people. You might obviously be a little more artistic or a little more analytical, but that's not dependent on just one side of the brain or the other. So the comment Rachel made earlier is actually more in line with what the right versus left side of the brains actually do. The right side of your brain controls most of the things and gets the sensations from most of the things on the left side of your body. So if I pinch my left arm, the right somatosensory cortex is what's getting that message. If I pinch my left arm, if I pinch my right arm, yeah, this is right. I can figure that out. This is my right arm. The left somatosensory cortex is what's getting that message. So most of what you're doing is crossing to the other side of the brain. And then from that, when you're trying to have a memory or you're trying to choose to do something, let's say a skateboard trick, or you're trying to paint a painting, or you're trying to solve a math problem, so many areas in your brain are working together, talking to each other, connecting across the corpus callosum, that essentially your whole brain is working all the time to do whatever you're doing. So there's no such thing as just right or left brain people, but someone who's right-handed versus left-handed, their motor cortex for that specific hand, so I'm right-handed, so the motor cortex for my, over here on the left side of my brain is probably a little more developed, has a little more connections than on the motor cortex of the right side of my brain going to my left hand. If I practiced more dexterity on my left hand, could I get to the same amount of axons and dendrites? Probably could. Yeah. So, other topics there. Oh, one interesting fact. Some people who have had, say, really bad injuries or maybe seizures, some people have had an entire hemisphere of their brain removed to stop things like seizures. Let's say, for example, a seizure was coming from this part of this brain on the picture. The doctors might kill the neurons just in that specific area, and that might stop any more seizures for the rest of your life. That would be not too bad, because then the other neurons and the networks around it can take over that responsibility. Probably be fine with a little bit of a recovery. For people who have their seizures starting on just one hemisphere of their brain, so if it's starting from here, 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 just as an example, but only on one hemisphere, there have been a few people who have had a whole hemisphere of their brain removed. This happens more often the younger a patient is, because the younger you are, the more easy it is for the other hemisphere of the brain to take on all that responsibility. So there are people who have lived their whole lives with only their left or only their right hemisphere of their brain, and been able to develop the same skills and abilities and talents as anybody with both hemispheres of the brain, which is pretty neat to see what the neurons in our brain can do. All right, so the endocrine system is part of the nervous system. It is the system of glands that puts different hormones into our blood. And so it is talking to the brain. It is sending messages throughout the body. The endocrine system sends messages to different organs through hormones in the blood. So with that, these are the different organs that can release those hormones. We've got the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, thyroid glands, thymus, ovaries, testicles, placenta, adrenal glands, pancreas. All of these can put hormones into our blood to communicate with other aspects of our body, whether it's organs or the brain itself. So with that, it's a lot slower than neurons talking to each other, because neurons use their axons, that electrochemical message straight down the axon, versus the endocrine system. You kind of have to fill the bloodstream up with enough level of that hormone that the other areas of your body can get that message. So you need to have enough of that hormone level that is detected. So you're kind of dependent on the speed of blood pumping through your body. So it's quite a bit slower than a neuron that can fire a couple thousand times a second. All right, so why do changes in the brain occur after we're born? Well, we've given a couple examples of this already. Essentially, experiences lead our brain to change. So this is why we prune certain areas versus make new connections, is because of experiences that we have. So with that being said, for very young infants, play, and children as well, even up to teenagers, play is really, really important for developing their brain. So especially with younger children, simple varieties of toys are some of the best things. So blocks are a really great example. You can have blocks that are different shapes, different colors, different textures. So a child can interact with it with their hands, with their mouth, looking at it, hearing the sounds they make as they clink together. So those simple kind of things, especially for a very young child, an infant and young child, really help their brain start to get experiences with different things, like different textures, different shapes, different sensations. So essentially that's what our brains need early on, is sensations and perceptions to start to learn and change. All right, so let's talk about sleep, some more physical development things. Newborns sleep on average about 16 to 17 hours a day. With that being said, it's usually in little chunks, so like 3.5-hour segments of sleep, and then they have some restful wakefulness, a short period, maybe like 40 minutes of full wakefulness where they'll be active and maybe laughing or interacting with people. Then they'll get to more of a relaxed wakefulness state, and then back to sleep for about 3 to 5 hours. And then it'll expand, those little chunks will expand generally to about 10.5 hours at about 3 to 7 months, just depending on the child. My children were closer to around 8 months when they got a big enough chunk like that. Some children might be even longer or very short. So with that, another aspect of physical development in their sleep is watching out for SIDS, so sudden infant death syndrome. So it's essentially defined as when an infant stops breathing at the during the night and it's without any apparent cause. Sometimes this can be attributed to things like in their bed with them, so a blanket or a pillow or a stuffed animal that because of their size and age, they don't have the motor control or the breathing control or understand what to do when they're having trouble breathing to know, oh, I should move over. Versus my 8-year-old, she'll like cover her head as she sleeps and just like have her mouth out from her blanket. It's really funny. But then if she turns over into her pillow, she'll have trouble breathing, but now her body knows, oh, I should move and shift the other way. An infant doesn't have that capacity, so often they will just die from that. So keeping their beds pretty simple, fairly firm, like firmer than you might think for a child. An infant is good. Not having pillows, not having blankets helps reduce these risks. Also, having them sleep on their back rather than their side or front reduces the risk of SIDS. Bed sharing is also a risk factor for SIDS. If a parent and the child are sharing a bed, the parent will probably have a blanket, probably have a pillow, maybe even accidentally smother the child themselves. So that is also a risk. So with that being said, for anything with a child and raising a child, it's important to weigh the risks and benefits. So some benefits of co-sleeping are a stronger attachment with the child. Some other benefits are it often makes it easier for the parent to feed the child, especially if breastfeeding, and have more sleep. So just roll over, feed the child, then roll back over and go to sleep kind of thing. That's a lot easier that way. And it makes it quicker to get to the child when they need something. So there's a lot of benefits, but it is also a higher risk factor for SIDS, so something to be aware of if you ever have a child. So this also goes into another thing, breast versus bottle feeding. What do we know about physical development of children who are breastfed versus children who are bottle fed? So a lot of this research comes from correlational studies. So asking people to report, hey, did you exclusively breastfeed? Did you exclusively bottle feed? Did you do some mix? So after the fact, there's not very many studies that are actual experiments. So saying, hey, you parents only breastfeed your kids. You parents only bottle feed your kids. There's very few full experiments like that. So some of this is just correlational relationships. So we don't know if it's necessarily causal. But with what we have, it seems like breastfeeding is a little bit better than even modern day formulas for nutrients, for cognitive development, for attachment between the parents. But that being said, modern day formulas are far, far better than they were 15, 20, 25 years ago. So it's definitely not something to ever shame a parent for not breastfeeding. So that happened to my sister-in-law because she had problems breastfeeding. So that was really terrible to see. But again, like I said, most of these studies are correlational. So that's another reason to say, well, we do see these relationships for children who are breastfed. Maybe they have these higher levels of nutrients. Maybe these aspects of growth seem to be faster, but we can't necessarily tie that to causal relationships unless we do something like an experiment. All right, so this is a good video if you want more detail on that. If, say, you wanted to do a question paper on breastfeeding or bottle feeding, that would be a good source to maybe start off watching, and then it's got links in its description. But for now in class, I think we'll skip over that. So let's talk about motor development. So we'll start with gross motor development. Dynamic systems theory is essentially a theory that says a child will develop new motor skills as they have experience, as they see people trying to behave, and as they try to mimic behaviors. So essentially, babies will try out different behaviors. They will try to reach out and grab something. You will see a very newborn infant making some reaching type behaviors. They'll kind of like wave their arms around, versus later on they'll be able to more directly try to go pick something up. So here's a mouse. It looks colorful like a block. So trying to grab something, then over time getting better at that. Dynamic systems theory says, well, all the systems are working together within that infant to make those things possible. So in order to see a block across the room and then crawl over to get it, you need the muscle capacity to hold yourself up and crawl. You need the visual capacity to see it across there and recognize what it is. And you need also the ability to know that you can go over there and grab it. So there's multiple systems to do that skill. So we're basically starting from scratch and building those skills as we do different things, is essentially what dynamic systems theory is saying. So you've got those neural capacities. You need the neural connections, the neurons, to be connected with each other to know that how to move your hand to grab something. You need the physical muscles to be able to lift up a block. And you need the perception to be able to see that block. So all these systems working together lead to these things. With that, it's important to give babies the opportunity to move, to interact with the environment, to hear different noises, to see different faces, to experience the world, essentially. So a variety of simple toys is really the best. I see a lot of things marketed as like, this is going to be the best toy for development of an infant. And it looks like really impressive. There's lots of stuff on it, but really pretty simple things that have a wide variety of shapes, textures, colors, sounds, things like that that are more simple are going to be really great for a baby. So baby toys that look like maybe boring are probably what is going to be the most useful for their development. So as well as that, don't just stick a baby in, say, a crib or a seat and just leave them locked there. Having that experience with the world is going to teach them what their brains need to know to be in the world. Pretty simple principle, but yeah. So reflexes, these are built-in reaction to stimuli. So most of these are built into our genetics. The ones that we're going into right now are built into our genetics because they have survival value. These first couple are really obvious how they help us survive. So the rooting reflex is when an infant, if you touch their cheek, they will move their head towards whatever it is and try to suck on it. So that obviously helps them find a nipple to get food. So if it's a pacifier, you could do that. This is one reason you don't want to have, say, Lego lying around for an infant, because if it touches their face, they'll try to go and suck on that, and that would not be good for an infant. So sucking reflex as well, anything that's in their mouth, they will try to suck on. So that helps them survive and feed and eat. Probably your book goes into some more reflexes. I wanted to just cover this last one. It's my favorite. It's called the Moro reflex. When startled, a very young infant will often flail their limbs out and try to grab onto anything around them and have really like wide eyes and look scared, what we interpret as scared, and try to grab onto anything. So I would sometimes spook my kids when they were calm and awake and just go boo or something like that to watch them do that Moro reflex. It's really funny, and hopefully I didn't traumatize my kids too bad. But the survival value of this probably goes back to our evolutionary past when our pre-human ancestors were in trees. So if, say, we fell or there was loud noise and we were dropped, spreading our limbs would help us fall through a tree slower, make it easier for a parent to grab a limb to help us survive. So that's probably, again, with looking at evolutionary adaptation, it's hard to pinpoint, oh, that's exactly why. But that is something that chimps and apes have as well, this reflex. So that might be where it came from, which is kind of neat. And it's really funny to watch the babies do that. But maybe I'm just a terrible person. So let's move on to more gross motor skills. So gross motor skills are skills that require large muscle bodies, so arms, chest muscles, leg muscles. If it's requiring those muscles, it's probably a gross motor movement, so walking, crawling. And with this, again, trial and error, being able to explore an environment, not just stuck in a car seat or something, enables a child to start to develop these capacities. One, it's got to make the neuron connections between the motor cortex and the sensory neurons and the motor neurons to move legs to be able to walk, but also the muscle structure to be able to stand up and walk, and core control as well. So these are kind of the approximate milestone times that you'll see. So some children might be really early for some of these or later than some of these. But again, this is kind of like one standard deviation, so it's not uncommon to be even over here or over here in these different skills. But it gives us kind of an idea of, on average, about when can children do these capacities. So on average, about at a year or a year and 2 months, most children will be walking alone on their own. All right, so fine motor skills are things that take more dexterity. So fingers, grasping, using a spoon, manipulating buttons, picking up the blocks. These are more fine motor skills. And fine motor skills are one of the reaching and grasping are one of the most important cognitive skills that children have, actually, because once they can reach and pick something up and interact with it intentionally, that develops their ability to make choices, and well, it helps start that ability and that opportunity to be able to make choices of what they want to have, like the toys or distinguishing between things. So it's a really huge portion of cognitive development. So when we're talking about these dynamic systems, before that ability to really pick something up, everything's kind of happening to the baby. They might cry because they're hungry or tired. Some of that's reflexive and some of it's not. But once they're able to actually choose something like in their environment, that's when a lot of their cognitive development really starts to increase dramatically, because they can now do things for themselves. It's pretty neat to see the things that they can accomplish. So mirror neurons are another part of this. This is a really good video on mirror neurons. I don't think we'll watch it as a class, but basically a mirror neuron is a neuron close to your somatosensory cortex oftentimes, that when you are watching someone do a behavior, so if a child is watching me pick up a block and pull it towards my face, the somatosensory cortex of mirror neurons will kind of run that same action in their own brain. So it will run through those motor neurons. The kid won't necessarily be doing it as they're watching it, but we all do this all the time. So if you're watching someone do a skateboard trick, you will notice how their feet are moving, how they're jumping, how their arms are moving, and your brain, your mirror neurons, will essentially run through that same process as if you are in that person's shoes. And that will help you as you go and then try to do that skateboard trick to be able to do it a little faster than if someone just described it to you. So in that way, we're kind of visual learners of so that's an example of observational learning, which is pretty neat. All right, so let's talk about sensation and perception. Hopefully you remember from your book, sensations are those things coming into your brain. So you get light data. So you know the wavelengths of lights that are coming through your eyes, your rods and cones. You have noises, volumes, pitch data coming from your ears. You have pain or heat senses coming from your hands. So that's your sensation, the inputs, versus your perception is what do you do with those inputs? What does that input mean? You've got this wavelength or this brightness of light. Is it a green bright light? Or is that a car? Is that a dog? Yeah, is that noise you hear? Is that someone talking? What are the words they're saying? Being able to interpret the sound as your favorite song versus someone talking is perception. So the sense is the input, the data, and then the perception is, well, what does that data mean? How do I put it together? So it's really hard to uncover what an infant's sensation and perceptual abilities are. For an adult, I could ask all of you, hey, do you hear me speaking in the microphone? And then either get a comment or maybe a thumbs up saying, yes, I do. A child's not going to have that capacity of understanding language, being able to give that message back. So how do we know what wavelengths of light a child can see, or how far a child can see things, or the volume levels that they're able to hear differently, or if they can distinguish between colors? So a lot of what we have to do is look at how the child behaves around different environments. So one thing that we'll use a lot is visual preference method. So we will say, okay, let's put these two similar color blocks, maybe a blue and a teal block. So maybe this color blue and this color teal. See if they can distinguish between those. Put two blocks, see which one they prefer. Or we could give them a bunch of blocks that are this color blue, and then once they get kind of bored of it, this is called habituation. Once they seem to get bored of this color blue, we put some blocks that are the same exact kind of blocks, but this color of teal. And if they now interact with the new color, we might know it would suggest to us that they can probably tell a difference between those two things. So that's habituation, is we present a stimulus, see if they get bored with it essentially, and then present a new stimulus, see if it looks like they're still bored. If they're still bored, they probably can't tell the difference between them. If they act differently towards the new stimulus, they can probably tell, it suggests that they can probably tell a difference between those two things. So you could do that with noise, two different wavelengths of sound, or two pitches of sound, see if they can tell the difference between two notes, for example. We also use eye tracking. So these are some machines that basically look at what the child is looking at. So here we have a camera facing forward of what the child sees, and this camera tracks the eye and the pupil to see, and then the computers can tell, okay, so for 5 seconds the child was looking over here at the blue puppet, and then for 2 seconds it was looking at the yellow puppet, then it looked at the person's face, then it looked over here, and then over here, such and such thing. So that can help also with that habituation and dishabituation to see, oh, can it tell the difference between the blue versus the teal, or the teal versus the green, things like that. So what do infants see? Again, these are the kind of methods we've used to do this. You can't say, hey, child, what are the letters on this eye chart, right? But from what we can tell, it seems like at about 1 month old, this is about what a child would see at about a couple feet, so like about arm's length away. Then 2 months old, 3 months old, and then a year old. So we have about 20/40 vision by the time we're about 6 months old. So that's pretty good. That's probably better than my actual vision without my contacts. So go babies. And then about by 9 months, most children have about 20/20 vision. So being able to see different faces, seeing different colors, seeing different things helps visual acuity happen quicker. So some of that is the eye getting used to seeing things, sending that message to the brain, building new connections in the occipital lobe to relay that information. So interesting stuff. All right, so also infants can't really distinguish that this would be a cat behind something, partially because they haven't had that much experience with objects passing over other objects. So over here, we've got something that looks cat-like. Then here, as an infant, there's some kind of bar-looking thing. And then over here, this is something that looks kind of cat-like. We can start partially tracking occluded objects at about 3 months, but before that, not really. So depth perception is another thing that develops perceptually, as well as our motor skills are developing at the same time. So about the same time that a child is able to maybe navigate down a stair or two, or maybe off the couch onto the ground, is about the same time their visual perception of depth perception is coming into really well. So at about 3 to 4 months old is when a child would be able to tell that this is a visual cliff, that this drops off here, versus a 6-month-old probably has enough depth perception already that they wouldn't just by themselves crawl across this glass. So I've got a video here that I think is really kind of interesting to watch to see the children's behavior here. It also goes into this dynamic systems theory.
In this study, babies between 9 and 12 months are brought into the lab and placed on a large plexiglass top table. Half of the table has a checkerboard pattern just underneath the surface, but halfway across is a visual cliff, which the baby can tell drops off steeply. The plexiglass top continues, so it's perfectly fine to proceed. But the baby isn't so sure, and this is a big drop for a baby just starting to crawl. She wants to get...
So you can see here that this baby has their depth perception. They're able to see and recognize that cliff. They also have the motor control to try and stick their foot out to get down what looks to be a step to them. Because that's what this is all about, is that perception. And then we'll see that these researchers, what they're testing in this case with these slightly older children is actually their socio-emotional connection with their parent and how that influences the choices and behaviors of the child.
She wants to get across to get the toy, but she's cautious and looks to the opposite end of the table where her mother is. The parent is instructed to smile or make a fear face.
If the mother is posing a fear face, the baby typically does not cross this stair step downward, this modified visual cliff or visual step. On the other hand, if the mother poses a smile or somehow poses a nonverbal communication that is not prohibitive but encouraging, the child is much more likely to cross over to her. This particular study demonstrates the role of nonverbal communication in determining the child's behavior in uncertain contexts. A baby.
So you did a really good job spelling that out pretty simply there, is that this specific study was trying to look at their nonverbal behavior of a caregiver and how it might influence a child in an uncertain context. So you could think of any other uncertain context in a child's life. So in a new place, like how are they going to react to it? Well, part of that will be dependent on the parent's behavior. But this goes to show, one, this visual cliff and how these children have this perception, they have the sensation, perception, they even have the physical capacity to get down probably a step about this big, but also goes into the socio-emotional aspect of it. So what is the attachment with the child? What if we used a securely attached person versus maybe a babysitter that they see once a week or something like that? Would they still behave the same way? So you can use this same kind of tool in a couple different ways to simulate the environment that children might be in. All right, so hearing. So I mentioned this earlier today. Fetuses in the womb can hear sounds. It seems like it makes them more attuned to pick up human speech earlier because you can hear like the pitch and the pattern of human speech. So with that, it is hard for infants to hear really soft sounds till about 3 months old. So with that being said, a lot of times when you see a baby, often our natural instinct seems to be to whisper. So talk really quiet to the baby and be really calm. But in reality, it's probably better to be at normal volume level or even slightly louder, not yelling at the baby's face, obviously, but talking maybe a little bit louder than you might otherwise think you should to help a baby hear, and letting a baby hear a variety of sounds, having different music, reading, especially as children start to read and things, reading things like poetry versus just normal, a normal book, rhyming versus songs. So having a big variety is what's going to be the best for language development. With this, information from two senses at once combine in intramodal perception. So this is a skill that develops over time. So those babies are looking, maybe listening, maybe feeling with their feet. So they're using multiple sensations at the same time to understand their environment. So it's still hard to connect different senses, even up to about 6 months old, because we're still making connections between different parts of our brains. So we have like the occipital lobe, all the neurons, well, a lot of the neurons are there. There's still some that are going to be migrating there. Temporal lobe, prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe. But we're still connecting those up all through those first couple of years of life. At age 1, most children are pretty good at using multiple senses altogether. Again, the main points here, or the main takeaways applied-wise, is let a baby interact with things in the environment, sounds, speech, music, smells, sights, all sorts of things. That's going to be the best. All right, so let's jump to cognitive development for the last couple minutes. This cognitive development is the last section of this chapter, and then we'll jump on to chapter 4. So we'll probably not finish all of cognitive development this time, but let's talk about Piaget. So Piaget had a popular stage theory. So it was one of the first, and it wasn't the very first. Freud actually had some stage theories about development too before this, but Piaget's was all focused on cognition, what a child could sense and perceive, and how a child would think and process information around them. So Piaget made a lot of observations of children, didn't do a whole lot of like experimenting, mostly did observational studies, but described what capacities the children had, how they might be processing. And so Piaget's theories stuck around for quite a long time as pretty good explanations of what we saw children doing. As of now in the field, there's aspects or bits and observations that Piaget made or that we have still held on to, but these stages in and of themselves, we've kind of thrown away, essentially. We've moved past them. So he wasn't specific enough in how infants or children could learn about the world, both their sensations and perceptions. Part of this was due to, well, it was a new science. He was making observations versus now we've done things like experiments, like the experiment you saw just a moment ago with the visual cliff. Now we can also do things like EEGs on children as they go about interacting with the environment. So Piaget's research did help to guide later work. Your book, I feel like it puts too much of an emphasis on Piaget at each different stage of development. Just know there's some aspects that are still really relevant from what Piaget said. It's still useful to learn about, but maybe not as much. I wish there was a little less focus on Piaget in your textbook. But that's what we've got. So researchers now in cognitive development, rather than looking at things in stages, we look at specific processes. So how do we learn language? How do you process a memory? How do you come up with a creative idea? How do you hear? Yeah, that's some good examples. So there's currently no overarching cognitive theory, like stage kind of theory. We're looking at specific aspects of cognitive tasks that you do generally. It all kind of falls under the Bronfenbrenner and Lerner bioecological systems model, that they're one of those systems that's working. So as our memory capacity increases, we can study specifically memory capacity. We can study how that interacts with how parents interact with us. That's kind of how the research is going, rather than saying, oh, by this time, by this stage, a child can remember three digits at random. So there's more focus also on the brain and neuroscience in cognitive psychology, and looking at cognitive development. So one of the key aspects that we look at in cognition is attention. So attention is simply the focusing of mental resources. If you're paying attention to class, you're focusing your attention on this versus maybe the other things like the doorbell dinging in my house just a minute ago. It involves cognitive processing. So how do we do that? How do we attend to things? How does an infant attend to something? What does that attention then do to their other learning of cognitive faculties? So that reaching and grasping is really important for cognition. Attention is probably the other most important aspect of initial cognitive development as well. So here you can actually see the eye tracking machine. So it can see with a camera what the child is looking at, which colors they're looking at, what order they're going in. And then based on that, you might be able to see, oh, well, maybe the child doesn't actually perceive red or orange differently, things like that. So with that, we can understand things better when we attend to them. When we're attending to our notes or our class or a person talking to us, we can understand and perceive that better because we're investing that energy into it. Children in their cognitive development, they develop a lot through imitation. So they will imitate faces, they will try to imitate noises. That's a big part of their cognitive development and a very important factor in learning. I think memory, I have some examples that take a little longer to explain for memory. So let's actually stop here, and we will come back to memory next time as a class, finish up chapter 3 and start with chapter 4. Chapter 4's lecture tends to be a lot quicker than the physical and cognitive development chapters. Our lectures take a little bit longer, but then the socio-emotional chapter tends to be a little shorter than these. So that is all for today. Thanks for being here. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or stick around and ask them on your microphone. But that is it for today. Talk to you later.